Individualism, Collectivism, the decline of society. The primitive human community. When examining society, we must first clarify what the society originally was, how everything began in a small, primitive community, and how it gradually evolved to produce the large and complex social orders we know today. It all began with the extended family, a communal life in which nearly everyone was related to each other in some way. Out of this ideal form of society arose dependencies, though there were still no major class distinctions. There was, however, a natural division of labor between the sexes and according to the different activities, skills, talents, and traits of each family member. Even in the age of hunters and gatherers, certain abilities were passed down, sometimes through skill, sometimes through lineage. A shaman, for instance, did not necessarily pass on his healing powers and prophetic gift to his own son. Rather, he was succeeded by the person best suited for the role. This was a form of elevation by merit. Other tasks, such as hunting or trading goods, were passed from father to son, while weaving, fabric work, and clothing repair were taught from mother to daughter. A human community was structured in a way similar to that of primates, most closely resembling that of chimpanzees or bonobos. In terms of clan structure, however, humans were closer to chimpanzees. Societies were almost always male-dominated. Within the family, the man was the head. This was the basic structure of every family, all over the world. Property was always passed down from father to the eldest son. The other sons and the daughters were left without inheritance. The younger, surplus sons eventually had to leave the homestead and establish their own households and farms, if they were capable of doing so. Otherwise, they stayed on as servants or went into service elsewhere, sometimes even as tenants of their own small plots of land. If property and farmland had been divided equally among all heirs, there would not have been enough to sustain each family, and the land would eventually have fallen out of family ownership, passing partly into the hands of strangers. Therefore, only the eldest son could inherit the farm, while daughters were married off into other families, usually to eldest sons or landowners, to bear children and continue the lineage. Daughters were not considered less valuable, but the danger of death during or after childbirth was real, and this was another reason why inheritance always went to the eldest son rather than the eldest daughter. In the fairy tales of the brothers Grimm, the conflict between the mother and the daughter-in-law is often portrayed as the greatest domestic tension, and it probably was. The mother, once the matriarch, grew old, and the daughter-in-law eventually took control of the household, since the eldest son usually worked outside in the fields. Only in very few ethnic groups did women take leadership within the family, usually in societies where men were frequently absent for long periods due to work, trade, or other responsibilities. The village community. The village community was a natural evolution of the family. It consisted of many individual families united in a larger clan or kinship group, living and working together because of their close blood ties. The village was usually governed by a council of male family heads, the so-called Council of Elders. Among them, of course, were also men who did not lead their own families, but were still respected for their experience or abilities. Women generally accepted that they did not take part in the men's meetings, since their main responsibilities lay in a completely different sphere. Many women voiced their concerns through their husbands, asking them to speak on their behalf, something that was entirely natural for both parties. Many grandmothers later recalled how they had placed complete trust in their husbands to represent the family's interests, and that they themselves had no desire to vote or participate directly. Even in our grandmother's time, it was common for women not to regard this arrangement as a disadvantage. When a husband spoke or voted on behalf of the entire family, disputes were rare. The man, as head of the household, also carried full responsibility for it, and therefore always acted or was expected to act in the family's best interest. The division of labor and specialization by gender was seen as something entirely natural. No woman would have thought that her husband should be responsible for caring for infants or small children. The work in and around the house was far too hard, and dealings within the village or with other men were considered the domain of men. Likewise, a man would never interfere in matters that traditionally fell within the woman's realm, areas in which nature had equipped her with remarkable skill and perfection. Cow's milk, for example, was only suitable for feeding infants once it had been diluted and boiled, a practice that became increasingly common during the industrial age. Villages become towns, the rise of craftsmanship. At first, there was little to no industry in the villages. Most crafts were carried out by each family themselves. There were tools for making shoes, saws and axes for cutting wood for heating, and there had long been spinning wheels and looms for producing fabrics and clothing. In the beginning, every farm produced nearly everything it needed on its own. Within the villages, however, the first workshops and specialized trades began to form, occupations that required a high degree of skill, specific tools, knowledge and experience. It no longer made sense for each family to produce these things independently. There were now farmers and crop growers, livestock breeders and herders. Common trades emerged. The blacksmith, who made tools and horseshoes, the tailor, who crafted clothing, the carpenter and joiner, who worked with wood, the miller, who produced flour, and the baker, who ensured the essential supply of bread. The male descendants typically inherited the father's trade, passing on knowledge and skills from one generation to the next. A baker did not interfere in the affairs of a carpenter, and a blacksmith did not concern himself with the miller's duties. There were also midwives who assisted with childbirth, beekeepers who supplied sweetness through honey, woodcutters who provided firewood, and charcoal burners who produced the charcoal used for ironworking by the blacksmith. Only much later did professions such as pastors or teachers of the parish, village mayors, and physicians emerge. As the village grew, it became a town. There were now shoemakers, butchers, potters, brewers, coopers, who made barrels for storage and transport, merchants, carters or coachmen, weaponsmiths and cobblers, each with their own workshops. Later became professions such as scribes, bookkeepers, notaries, administrative officials, and councilmen. The larger the population grew, the more specialized the trades became. Even so, people still formed a community of purpose, acting for the most part in the interest of the collective. The town administration ensured that all work and services were carried out accordingly to established rules and standards. In this small village, no one was excluded from this order. Everyone was a part of society. Industrialization dispossesses the people. The cities grew larger with distinct districts and an ever deeper division of labor. New professions emerged. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade, bankers lending money, warehouse clerks and apprentice traders, locksmiths and metal workers, glaziers and window builders, weavers, dyers and textile manufacturers, doctors and surgeons, apothecaries, bathhouse attendants, musicians, singers and actors, printers and teachers in urban schools, mayors, city councillors, judges, lawyers, policemen and guards, bridge builders, road builders, and ship captains. The division of labor and professional specialization became fully established. Eventually, the small manufacturing workshops evolved into assembly lines, and the industrial age ushered in automation and mass production. This marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline for a large portion of the population. Many who had once been farmers, owners of their own land and independent workers, but who were no longer heirs to their fathers' farms, were now forced to earn a living in the cities. Industrialization went hand in hand with the growth of the rural population, which was made possible by improved medical care and living conditions. Dispossession had long been a feature of rural tradition, since inheritance law required that the ancestral farm remain undivided in the hands of a single heir. This misfortune continues in the cities, where dispossessed sons and daughters of farmers had to seek paid work. The factory owners exploited this situation shrewdly. They had before them a labor force of landless people desperate for income, and they produced goods, products and commodities for the entire citizenry, which sold rapidly, often under monopoly conditions. At this time, the economy and industry were not yet engaged in fierce competition. Business was booming through the division of labor in production. It was during this period that the idea of Nuremberg mercantilism arose, buying raw materials cheaply, processing them into intermediate and finished goods, and selling them at a large profit. Most factories enjoyed exclusive monopolies in the manufacture of highly specialized products. The banks take control. In order to build and operate machines, the industrial sector had to make massive investments, and to do so, it needed to borrow money from the banks. These loans made the bankers immensely wealthy. Since the central banks, sometimes even privatized central banks, were able, from their very inception, to create money virtually out of nothing, the managers of these institutions became unimaginably rich. They were both the distributors and the beneficiaries of this system, channeling funds to private banks. Ordinary people and even many others within the economy eventually no longer understood how, through the mechanism of double-entry bookkeeping of expenditures and revenues, money could be generated out of thin air and then lent to individuals in exchange for interest payments. In the end, this interest was paid not in abstract value, but in the real labor performed by working people within society. When industry and manufacturing later began to collapse under competitive pressure, the private banks continued to thrive. Whether the economy was in crisis or in boom, the banks prospered all the time, for credit was always in demand. In times of economic expansion, to finance new production facilities, and in times of recession to provide emergency loans. The private banks always made the profit, the work was done by everyone else. The conquest of a new continent. When industrial production began to decline due to competitive pressure and the falling demand for goods and services, additional conflicts arose among the already largely dispossessed population. Although industry was in principle capable of satisfying all needs, the first shortages began to appear within these social orders. A deep divide had already formed between the rich and the poor, and through the ongoing division of labor among families, clans and kin groups, as well as the distinction between large property owners and the dispossessed, this divide grew ever wider and was passed on from one generation to the next. After the feudal aristocratic class society of the great landowners who lived off the rents paid by the tenant farmers, a bourgeois class society emerged in the cities, based on precisely the same principles of exploitation through external ownership. Working people could no longer afford to own their homes. They were forced to rent at high prices from property owners and to sell their labor to factory owners on terms dictated by them. They had no choice. They needed income in order to survive. The conditions of survival were determined entirely by those who held property, the great owners of real estate and industry, while the dispossessed had little or no bargaining power. For workers, the state of coercion and scarcity was absolute and complete. Among those who emigrated, roughly 70 to 80% were laborers seeking to escape poverty and hopelessness in Europe. They included landless peasants, day laborers and craftsmen who financed their emigration by selling household goods or livestock, taking out loans from private banks, relatives, churches or emigration agencies, and thereby often falling into debt. There were also so-called immigration companies, which offered jobs to emigrants but at the cost of new financial dependence, debt bondage under another name. About 10 to 15% of the emigrants were small entrepreneurs or skilled craftsmen who hoped to find better economic opportunities, land ownership, or business prospects in America. Fewer than 5% were industrial magnates, bankers, or large landowners with international connections that already extended to America. They owned property and enjoyed income in Europe. They did not need America for their livelihood. Instead, they profited even further from those who emigrated there. Thus, there were always beneficiaries of emigration, and there were those who, in the end, paid far more than they ever gained in return. All in all, it was about the management of vast sums of money, enormous wealth that was transferred from Europe to the United States. Money and labor from Europe and land from the indigenous people. It was not only the money transferred from Europe to America that generated the prosperity of the former British colonies. It was also the masses of laborers who, for meager wages, had to accept any kind of work. These workers could be exploited in every possible way and often never achieved the better future they had dreamt of in America. Trapped in spirals of debt, they spent their lives paying off loans and obligations. Once again, it was primarily the elite of industrial magnates, bankers, and large landowners from Europe, many of whom had also emigrated, who profited the most. By opening up and exploiting an entire continent, they enabled a level of value creation unprecedented in human history. America became rich and powerful, built upon European capital and the annexation of an entire continent. This became the foundation of America's wealth for the first 200 years of its history. That the indigenous peoples had already inhabited this land for at least a guessed 100,000 years mattered to no one, given the prevailing concepts of property ownership. This reality was consistently swept under the rug. It was unpleasant to acknowledge that one's success rested on the dispossession of land and the exploitation of laborers, day laborers, and small farmers. Yet the law legitimized everything, and morality and ethics adapted accordingly. America is the best amongst all nations, and many generations achieved great things, but without the financial and material assistance from Europe, the cheap labor, and the vast annexed lands of the native peoples, America as we know it today would be different. The redistribution of wealth and property continues in the great cities and has become even more extreme with each economic succession. Division of labor, specialization, and automation keep increasing. The same redistribution mechanism that once took hold in Europe was now unfolding in America. Wealth and property continue to be concentrated in the hands of those who already possess them, and large-scale ownership expands even further. Private banks grow richer and more powerful. The stock market functions as another machine for redistributing labor into wealth and property. Meanwhile, the impoverishment of the wider population increases steadily because the incentive system, the social and economic order that was supposed to work for everyone at all times and in all places, has fallen into a one-sided imbalance. Labor and redistribution. Creating incentives is the first and fundamental principle on which a free, open, and liberal society can and must function. Every person wants as much freedom as possible, as much security, and as much wealth and property generated from their own labor. They want to enjoy the fruits of their work. This is both natural and just. The problem arises when a person's own freedom turns them into a dictator over the collective of all others, when they prevent others from enjoying the fruits of their labor as well. That is exactly the situation we live in today. Masses of capable, hard-working, and motivated people have no employment and no income because the system no longer enables it. The social contract was designed to allow individuals to participate in the community under the promise that, through cooperation, they could fulfill themselves, become part of the society, and benefit from improved economic efficiency, which in turn should lead to greater personal freedom, security, and prosperity. But now the opposite is happening. The social contract no longer exists. Everyone is left to fend for themselves, struggling to survive in a metaphorical urban jungle. There are only very few employment opportunities to support oneself and one's family, and no assurances that the system will protect anyone from arbitrary decisions. When the economy was growing and there was enough of the economic pie for everyone, this was not a problem. Everyone could at least grab a few crumbs to survive. But things have changed. The freedom of the individual has become the oppression of the masses. Every successful citizen succeeds because they have found ways to live off the labor of others. They have the means, methods, and opportunities to take from everyone else. And the system does more than merely support this redistribution. It is built upon it. Those who are wealthy in terms of property and assets can create labor slaves, rental slaves, and debt slaves, efficiently depriving others of the value of their work. In some countries, 80 to 90% of citizens are effectively rental slaves. They can no longer afford their own housing and often lack the income to support their families. The stock market, only intended to allow people to share in wealth through property rights, has become a massive redistribution machine, taking the labor of those who produce and giving it to large property owners and their entitlements. Once great nations which claim to uphold the freedom of all as a guiding star for human liberty have now been reduced to societies of mutual exploitation and materialism. The monetary system generates labor out of nothing. National banks, according to legal frameworks and established regulations, can create labor out of nothing through a simple accounting entry. This would not necessarily be problematic, because the additional labor generated annually by people must correspond to a counter value that can be used as a form of value in society, what we call money. There is money that circulates, money that remains as book money, and money that, through dependency on wealth and property, continues to redistribute labor within the economy, almost always only to the benefit of those who already possess wealth and property. This systemic disharmony in monetary mechanisms would not be an issue if society were structured cooperatively, collectively, and with solidarity. In such a society, everyone would only charge for services what is just and fair and would receive an equitable return in exchange. But modern societies do not operate this way. They are based on the freedom of the individual, a concept called individualism. The individual can demand any price for a service that the buyer is able or willing to pay. This system would only be fair and just if everyone had equal wealth and property, equal expenses for living, and equal needs, desires, and expectations for their lives. Furthermore, such a free society would only function justly if every individual truly acted as an independent but fair and just individual. There was once a time in advanced modern societies when these basic conditions existed. Every person was treated as an individual, entitled not only to services but also to personal freedoms, and could be assessed fairly and independently based on that individual status. The reality today is no longer individualistic but collectivistic. The democracy of the individual has been replaced by the dictatorship of clans, which have banded together at all levels, either to gain an advantage over the individually structured citizen or because they could no longer survive alone in this individualistic hell. The result is that, behind the scenes, everything is structured according to clan interests. Laws have been created that are nowhere officially written, yet do not contradict public order. They operate in the background as the real framework behind the lofty principles of democracy, open society, and human freedom. These two forms of order, the official, publicly proclaimed version with democracy and citizens' rights, and the hidden, established plutocratic dictatorship, have always stood in diametric opposition. The public version offers citizens' participation, the idea of popular sovereignty, and the politically enacted will of the people. The hidden version, however, is the clandestine dictatorship. The clandestine monarchy was historically the only system that openly admitted its pyramidal, hierarchical structure. Democracies, by contrast, never admitted this, even though through capitalism and neoliberal capitalism they had long transformed into plutocracies, under whose hidden order the clandestine dictatorship was quietly established, unnoticed by the uneducated masses. Liberty, equality, fraternity. The French Revolution produced little more than the rolling of heads on the guillotine. There were expropriations, but property laws were not reformed, and inheritance law remained intact. As a result, the descendants of those executed continued the very work of redistribution that their predecessors had begun. During and after the revolution, slogans such as liberty, equality, fraternity were heard, but behind the curtain of official historiography, the structures the revolution sought to destroy were rebuilt. Throughout modern human history, these processes repeated themselves in other countries, in other societies, and with different consequences. History had not yet reached its end. As events continued to cycle, the old clandestine dictatorships, based on Roman property law, re-established themselves, this time under the protection of democracy, which served to legitimize their hidden machinations and crimes. No matter what new ideals emerged, whether socialism, communism, democracy, free market systems, free money, or communes, over time these orders allowed the clandestine dictatorships to reassert themselves. Evolution has always acted on all living beings. The winners were always those best adapted to their environment, those who could seize resources, products, goods, services, power, and privileges most effectively. Thus, the essence of humanity, as it is today, is greed, ignorance, ruthlessness, violence, and crime. The good human emerges in a stable, long-lasting form only within clan systems or larger, hierarchically structured civilizations. These are societies in which questions of power are resolved through clear hierarchies and defined disparities in authority. Wherever stable and peaceful societies exist, they are structured in a pyramidal hierarchy that cannot be challenged, because power relations and living conditions form immutable layers. Those who attempt to bypass this hierarchical system cannot, because the stratification and power structures are already established and unchangeable. Yet this rigid structure provides many people with a type of freedom that they could never enjoy under other clandestine dictatorships, as long as the lowest strata remains within the favor of the elite. The more interest groups a society contains, the more conflicts, turmoil, and power struggles arise between clans, kin groups, and the many factions vying for influence and resources. In such a society, the free, open, liberal ideal gives way to a reality in which everyone fights against everyone else, especially clan against clan and faction against faction, each with conflicting interests. In these societies, absolute struggle prevails, and the ordinary poor citizens pay the price. They no longer enjoy human rights because they have no right to work, no right to income, no right for a family, no right to freedoms. Work is unavailable, income cannot be generated, and families cannot be sustained. Freedom is now reserved only for the rich and powerful, those who own property and wealth. The good world, a vision. Future generations will be tasked with creating a world in which the system of incentives finally works for all people and citizens. This is no simple undertaking, because almost all societies that call themselves modern today have, in the background, already become clandestine dictatorships. In reality, the old hierarchical order of living beings has never truly disappeared. It still holds validity and will continue to do so indefinitely. Why this is so is something each person must ask themselves. Why does a mother naturally favor her own children over other children, or a father protect his spouse above all other spouses? Always, one's own lineage is prioritized over others. Without this principle, evolution itself could not have occurred. Humanity would have never developed into what it is today. Because this is the case, it is insufficient to rely solely on individual laws behind which clandestine dictatorships can hide. The first principle of all higher beings must be recognized as the clandestine dictatorship, and the entire system of order must be structured on this understanding. Once one accepts that the eternal order is, in fact, the clandestine dictatorship, the next step is to seek a clan-based order in which all clans in a society can compete civilly, openly, and without deceit. This ritualized power struggle between clans, kin groups, and interest groups must occur publicly so that everyone can see who is qualified in which domain, by what methods and successes, and the power and influence they thereby attain. At the same time, it is essential that every individual is embedded within a clan, with clearly defined rights, duties, and responsibilities, so that the incentive system is never lost to them. This is the secret to a well-functioning society, the foundation upon which the system of incentives can work again, allowing a good, fair, and just society to become the standard. The first cultural civilization on Earth is therefore one in which all powerful clans and kin groups are tested in publicly observable competitions to determine their true leadership over others. This cannot be achieved through civil law alone. It requires a differentiated legal framework of clan rights and clan responsibilities. Most modern global societies are still as far from this as we are from the Stone Age. Today, we have only slogans: freedom, democracy, equality, fraternity, human rights, and civil rights, while many people die on the streets. This is the terrible inconsistency of our so-called human order, simultaneously claiming to uphold humanity while consigning people to death. These two realities are fundamentally incompatible. Creating a system in which all of this becomes possible, and thereby building the first genuine cultural civilization, will be the great task of coming generations. In the distant future, this could allow humanity to achieve the only form of a golden state. This vision is not a call to destroy the current order with violence. It is intended to illustrate why nothing can be expected from contemporary politics unless fundamental structural change occurs. The end of the world is not a distant event, it is already upon us. We live in a period that represents the lowest point in human civilization to date. The choices we make or fail to make will determine whether we open the door to a world of enduring human flourishing or plunge into civilization collapse. Masses of people are on a path that leads directly to destruction if the system remains unchanged. It is not true that Western individualism alone can deliver humanity from this crisis, nor is it certain that Eastern collectivism will preserve human freedoms in the future. The solution does not lie in choosing between individualism or collectivism, or judging which path is better. Rather, a societal system must be constructed that works for all through a successful system of incentives, preventing society from falling again into the cycle of collapse. Today, we are forced to choose between extremes: communism or neoliberal capitalism, collectivism or individualism. And this very choice makes civilizational decline unavoidable. That decline is already underway, though must yet to be perceived.